They called it the Redwoods Vault, a name that sounded like folklore until quietly released memos and sworn statements made it a place with a locked purpose. For decades, hikers and timber crews reported odd smells, sudden radio failures, and shadows that moved with an intelligence among the oldest trees. Officially, it was timber management and wildfire staging. The whispers, now supported by documents, paint a darker picture, a covert facility carved into the roots and earth beneath an isolated canopy, built to store evidence too strange, too risky, or too politically inconvenient to be shared. What was inside the vault changed how some scientists and officials thought about life itself. This is not a story about big footprints. It's about material and behavior that defied categories, tissues that did not match any known primate, audio files that sounded like learning in progress, and artifacts that reacted to electromagnetic fields as if they had purpose. The claim is bold. The vault contained living anomalies and data that force us to reconsider the boundaries between human, animal, and engineered life. Today, I will take you through what those records show. We will lay out the kinds of evidence the state decided to hide, the scientific oddities that triggered classification, and the eyewitness accounts that kept the story alive. Our sources are not rumor. Declassified memos, ranger logs, field biology reports, and whistleblower testimonies form the backbone of this case. Each piece fits into a pattern of containment, concern, and careful secrecy. You will hear about specimens whose cellular structure combined mammalian features with previously undocumented architectures, tissues that suggested distributed neural processing rather than a single centralized brain. You will hear of hours of audio that at first sounded like wind and wildlife, but under analysis showed repeated patterns, mimicry of human sounds, and deliberate delays as if an observer were studying human speech. You will hear about synthetic fabrics threaded with metallic microfilaments that altered acoustic fields, soil samples with molecular markers that matched fragments found inside the vault, and security footage that showed shapes moving with practiced mimicry. We will also explain why officials sealed the site. The discovery was not merely embarrassing, it posed potential ecological and national security risks, a repeating genetic motif present in tissue and soil, materials that adapted to electromagnetic stimuli, and behaviors that seemed to learn from human presence. Containment, then, was as much about preventing spread and confusion as about hiding facts. By the end of this presentation, you will understand three things: what was discovered in the Redwoods Vault, why those findings were deemed dangerous enough to classify, and what those discoveries imply for anyone who walks beneath the giant trees tonight. Listen closely. The proof comes with documents and testimony, and the implications are urgent. What was stored under the redwoods may not have been merely inert evidence. It may have been an adaptive mystery learning to answer back. To judge the Redwoods Vault, you cannot rely on rumor. You need witnesses who carry credentials and records, people whose names, training, and paperwork tie them to the site. That is why this next part of the story leans on three pillars: laboratory science, field stewardship, and controlled contractor reporting. Together they form a pattern that moves the vault from local folklore into the realm of institutional concern. First, meet Dr. Elaine Mercer, a molecular ecologist with a national reputation for careful, repeatable work. For 15 years, her lab received samples from across the Pacific Northwest, labeled restricted redwood excavations and similar euphemisms. Hair shafts, small tissue fragments, bone scrapings, some arrived sealed by federal courier, others by anonymous drop with chain of custody notes attached. In sworn interviews, Dr. Mercer describes a clear and persistent finding. Sequencing runs produced DNA segments that matched nothing in public mammalian databases. They were not simply mutations of known species. They contained conserved anomalies, short gene blocks that recurred across unrelated samples and bore regulatory patterns linked to nervous tissue development. She did not speculate about myth. Mercer spoke of lab standards, contamination controls, negative controls, replicated extractions. When those rules were followed, the anomalies persisted. She used the phrase, conserved anomaly, the way a pathologist uses lesion as a thing to be investigated, not dismissed. Her testimony is crucial because it anchors the vault's contents to hard data, not hearsay. Second, the boots-on-the-ground perspective comes from former Forest Service Ranger Thomas Grady. Grady kept meticulous incident logs from his post near the cordon zone. His reports record recurring effects, radios that failed within a fixed radius of the perimeter, GPS glitches at certain coordinates, and animals, deer, ravens, coyotes, behaving as if the area emitted an aversive signal. Grady's entries are dated, time-stamped, and later corroborated by wildlife biologists who noticed abrupt shifts in migration and feeding patterns in the adjacent groves. In affidavits, he explicitly rejected the timber staging explanation, writing that the site was treated like biological containment and evidentiary storage, language not typically used for forestry projects. Finally, there are the contractor documents. Fragments of internal communications and partial reports leaked under A federal contractor assigned to analyze vault material submitted a preliminary assessment that contained language unusual for routine environmental work. References to neural-like connectors embedded in lignified plant matter and 2 hours of audio, recordings where the recorded sounds displayed structured cadence rather than random noise. The contractor's lead wrote, in a leaked line later blacked out, that the materials were biologically unique and of potential dual-use concern. That phrase, dual-use, triggers immediate national security protocols because it signals that a discovery could be applied in civilian contexts or weaponized. Taken together, these three sources converge. Scientist, steward, and analyst each observed anomalies in their own domain. Unexpected genetics in the lab, anomalous environmental and animal behavior in the field, and evidence of complex structures and patterned sound in contractor reports. None of the pieces alone would guarantee a classified response. Combined, they create a mosaic, empirical oddities verified by trained observers, technological effects at a distance, and materials complex enough to draw specialized analysis and concern. This is why secrecy became the de facto policy. The evidence did not merely suggest an unknown animal. It suggested biological mechanisms and behaviors that challenged the way agencies assess risk. A repeating molecular motif across tissue and soil, equipment failures tied to location, and audio artifacts that implied learning or mimicry. Those red flags explain why the vault was not treated as a natural history curiosity. It became a closed question, contained, studied behind clearance, and, for now, kept from the public eye. Before we open the vault, we need to shift from rumor into detail. The items inside were not curiosities in jars. They behaved like questions, small, precise, and deeply disturbing when measured. Start with the acoustic evidence, because sound is where the vault first spoke in a way humans could record. Field teams planted tiny microtransmitters in hollow stumps, sinkholes, and the bases of standing, dead tree places that smelled oddly of iron and rot. For hours, those devices captured what sounded at first like wind and distant animal chatter. But when technicians ran the recordings through spectral analysis, the patterns rearranged themselves into form. Noise became cadence. Chaos showed structure. Harmonics appeared that did not match any local species. On spectrogram, sequences repeated with slight shifts in timing and pitch and architecture of sound that looked deliberate. A linguist who reviewed the files said the patterns bore the hallmarks of adaptive mimicry, not random copying, but graded learning, where each repetition tested and altered a fragment of the soundscape. More unnerving were recordings that echoed human speech. In several files, field radios left on in the vicinity were answered not by other humans but by a sequence that wound around syllables, imitating distress calls, the clipped cadence of safety checks, even fragments of names. In one morning capture, a recorded phrase from a ranger, "all clear at grid 3, was picked up 30 seconds later in the microtransmitter, delayed, flattened in pitch, then repeated twice with a clear pause as if being parsed. Those pauses looked less like mimicry and more like study. Sound led to touch and sight. Internal inventory lists, shown in part in redacted memos, cataloged physical specimens that made technicians rewrite their expectations. There were fibrous attachments, ligament-like strands that felt chitinous to the touch, braided into old-growth root fibers as if the forest itself had been stitched with tissue. Partial cranial fragments arrived in sealed cases, bone sutures that closed in unfamiliar patterns, densities that sat between mammal and reptile norms, and shapes that suggested a skull engineered for something other than a single, central brain. Teeth, when present, displayed impossible combinations, broad molars for grinding beside, slicing incisors, a dental map that could not be explained by diet alone. Whoever or whatever made these mouths must have needed to process many kinds of material or to perform functions humans had not considered. Photographs in the appendices, grainy but clear enough, showed tiny abrasions on bone that were not consistent with predator chewing. The edges had microstriations like those left by stone tools, but at a scale no known human-made implement in the field could have produced. Microscopic analysis suggested deliberate modification, abrasion patterns that looked like filing and polishing, intentional shaping rather than scavenging. The implication was hard to swallow. Tool use, or at least the remnants of tool-like processes, nested inside an ecosystem no one had cataloged as technological. Environmental data complicated the picture. Radiation counts around specific storage bays were not uniformly high but clustered in narrow bands, spikes that matched the geometry of shelving and crate placement. The isotope signatures did not read like fallout or industrial contamination. They paired instead with low-level enrichment profiles seen in certain advanced research labs. Soil chemistry reports added a biological dimension. Within a 20-meter ring of the vault, nematode and microfauna populations displayed mutation patterns that defied normal rates. Genetic assays showed repeated anomalous, small but consistent changes that implied either accelerated mutation or the presence of an external genetic element altering genomes across species. That same recurring motif kept turning up teeny molecular footprints in both tissue and nearby soil. It suggested not isolation but exchange. The vault's contents were leaving traces in the landscape, and the landscape was leaving traces on the contents. Containment, in other words, was porous. And then there were the human stories, the kind that haunt official logs. A retired contractor swore under oath to a night when security cameras caught a large, cloaked shape moving between storage bays. The silhouette matched no recorded human height or gait exactly, but its timing mirrored the walking rhythm of a technician who had been on site earlier that day. Security footage later showed crates slightly ajar and a notebook with its pages. Rearranged handwritten notes shifted into new orders that made partial sense. The technician, when interviewed, insisted he had not left those entries. Yet the handwriting was unmistakably his, only reorganized. Was it prank, misremembered sleep deprivation, or an intelligence that learned by copying? The pattern across audio, tissue, soil, and memory pointed to something more troubling than coincidence. An entity that listened, an entity that altered things, an entity that left fingerprints, not just on wood and bone, but on the behavior of people who watched it. That is the stage on which the vault sits, not simply a repository for strange objects, but a living experiment of containment. Sounds that study us, tissues that refuse tidy classification, molecular traces that cross borders, and a responsiveness that suggested observation itself changed the observed. When you stand at the edge of those records, the eerie clarity emerges. This was not passive evidence. It was interaction, and interaction changes risk into responsibility. When the sealed door of the vault was finally cataloged, what lay inside didn't look like a single discovery. It looked like a conversation between forms of life science had never learned to read. First, the tissues. Biologists expected damaged specimens, old carcasses, preserved badly. Instead, they found composite material fibers and flesh fused in ways that refused easy labels. Under the electron microscope, samples showed clusters of neurons that did not group into a single brain. Instead, ganglia formed repeating lattice-like structures embedded in keratinous sheets and fibrous matrices. Imagine a network of small processing centers spread through tissue, linked by dense bundles of conductive-like filaments. The impression from multiple labs was the same. This was not centralized cognition. It was distributed processing information handling spread through body-like tissue rather than concentrated in a skull. That has consequences. A nervous system arranged like that could process input across large surfaces, adapt locally, and reorganize after damage. It fits the other oddities investigators had already seen: tissue that healed in non-standard patterns, organs partially replicated across different body regions, and reflex responses that triggered from touch far from any central hub. In field notes, a pathologist wrote, "Plainly, this material thinks without one brain." Second, there were the sound archives, microphones and improvised recorders, some hidden in hollow stumps and some placed near suspected bedding sites, produced hours of audio that changed with analysis. At first, the recordings sounded like wind, sap, drip, and distant birds. But when technicians applied spectral enhancement and slowed playback, patterns emerged, repeated phonemic shapes that hovered at the edges of human consonants and vowels, cadences that imitated the timing of nearby radio traffic, and phrase-like bursts that matched snippets of words used by field teams. One recording stands out in the files, a 2-minute clip where an entity appears to listen, then reproduce a commander's short radio transmission with 5-second delays and slight pitch shifts. It repeats the message, then fragments it and strings unknown syllables between the words. Linguists who reviewed the clip concluded the sequence showed active learning vocal mimicry adjusted by feedback, not random parroting. The audio suggested an entity studying human sound patterns, practicing and altering them over time. Third, the artifacts. In sealed crates, examiners found textile-like materials interwoven with metallic microfilaments. These fabrics were soft to the touch but reactive when exposed to low-frequency electromagnetic fields. They hummed, bent light subtly, and altered nearby acoustic signatures. Field notes call them adaptive substrates. They appeared in nests or bedding contexts, sometimes layered with plant bedding, sometimes wrapped around preserved tissue. Tests showed these materials could change resonance in response to applied fields, and in at least one controlled exposure they amplified certain harmonics while damping others. Contractors speculated they might be either constructed by an intelligent maker or the product of long-term interaction between organism and environment materials that changed with use. Fourth, the molecular signature. Across unrelated sample statistics from different crates, swabs of soil from near containment, Even mucus traces found inside vent slabs found a small recurring DNA motif. It was short, specific, and didn't match databases of known organisms. Its pattern resembled insertion sites used by retroliments genetic sequences that can integrate into host genomes and move between cells or species. The motif showed up not just in the preserved specimens, but in nematodes, fungi, and plant root samples taken within 20 meters of the vault. In simple terms, the vault's contents had left molecular fingerprints in the living landscape. That finding changed the stakes. If a shared genetic element is present across species at the site, containment is not just about keeping materials locked in a building. It is about stopping an exchange that has already begun between stored anomalies and the surrounding ecosystem. Soil chemistry reports, when cross-referenced with these motifs, showed subtle but consistent shifts in microfauna genetics mutations and insertions that could not be explained by typical background rates. The pattern suggested active biological interaction at the molecular level. Finally, bring the parts together: networked tissues, vocal learning, adaptive fabrics, and a recurring genetic motif. These were not isolated curiosities. They formed a coherent portrait of something that could sense, learn, and leave traces outside itself. In practical language, what the vault held was living evidence of a system that adapted to observers and, in so doing, altered its environment. This is why scientific reviewers and defense analysts reacted with alarm. The discoveries didn't fit in known categories of known plant or engineered organism, and they suggested pathways for spread and influence that standard containment protocols were not designed to address. The decision to classify, then, was not merely bureaucratic overreach. It was a response to a set of findings that forced a hard question. How do you safely study a thing that learns from being watched and changes the ground it touches? The vault's inventory, in other words, was more than dossiers and odd bones. It was evidence of a biological reality that blurred lines, distributed cognition instead of a single brain, mimicry that progressed into structured vocal learning, materials that interfaced with fields and sound, and a genetic signature present in both specimen and soil. Those combined traits explain why authorities chose secrecy and why the Redwoods Vault remains, for now, a guarded answer to the promise we set out to fulfill. The government found not one monster, but a set of living processes that challenge how we define life and how we protect ourselves from what that life might become. When the first lab reports confirmed networked neural tissues and the acoustic files proved active vocal learning, officials stopped treating the Redwoods Vault as a simple archive. Internal memos obtained later, many heavily redacted, show a rapid shift from curiosity to crisis management. Within days, agencies invoked containment protocols normally reserved for high-risk biological agents. The compound was reinforced, entries funneled through airlocks, surfaces sterilized on timed cycles, electromagnetic shielding installed in storage bays, surveillance was stepped up from motion sensors to layered systems, thermal imaging, passive acoustic arrays, and chemical sniffers tuned to pick up tiny changes in volatile organic compounds. Access lists were narrowed to a handful of people with the highest clearances. That tightened perimeter masks a more consequential decision made behind closed doors. A multi-agency task force formed that included biosafety officers from the military, infectious disease modelers, behavioral ecologists, linguists, and anthropologists. Their mandate was blunt: evaluate the risk of release, determine the potential for ecological integration, and design a path for safe study. The group's early assessment summarized in a single redacted paragraph: quaint, the phrase that guided every subsequent action: active adaptive vector. In plain terms, the materials were judged capable not only of persisting, but of changing behavior in response to observation and of leaving molecular traces in the living soil around them. From that diagnosis flowed a twofold policy: defensive suppression and selective study. Defensive suppression aimed to slow curiosity and limit contact. Public messaging was reframed as routine forestry work and wildfire staging. Permits were canceled without explanation. Road signs went up announcing hazard mitigation and restricted access, giving an official face to the secrecy. Locals were told of remediation efforts, and small payments or temporary evacuations smoothed over complaints, where whistleblowers later tried to tell the truth. Their accounts were met with non-disclosure agreements, legal pressure, and, in some cases, offers of relocation. These moves reduced immediate risk of public exposure, but they also seeded mistrust, exactly the consequence secrecy was meant to avoid. Selective study was the other half of the plan. A small, tightly supervised group of researchers were given controlled access under strict conditions: no unsupervised fieldwork, limited contact hours, mandatory use of personal psychometric monitoring, and enforced debriefs. Records show that mental health checks were not a courtesy. Testimony from one contractor states that repeated exposure to the vault's audio and visual materials produced cognitive effects: sleep disruption, derealization, and in 2 cases, persistent mimicry behaviors among lab staff. The task force treated these as operational risks. Scientists were rotated, their notes heavily redacted, and samples moved between secure facilities to avoid any single point of failure. Containment measures extended beyond physical security. The task force initiated ecological monitoring programs designed to detect the motif dose, short genetic sequences found in tissue and soil across a wider area. Soil cores were sampled on grid patterns radiating from the vault, and sentinel organisms, earthworms, nematodes, and small mammals were tagged and monitored for genetic changes. Where anomalies appeared, authorities quietly removed specimens and sterilized sites. The record is mixed. In some places, the motif vanished after remediation. In others, it persisted at low levels. Those lingering traces were cataloged, then classified. What do these actions mean for the public? First, containment buys time, not certainty. The task force's own internal debates leaked in fragments reveal fear that suppression alone would only delay the problem. If the motif can embed in soil microbes, or if the adaptive substrates can replicate or influence animal behavior, then localized secrecy can become the seed of broader ecological change. The materials may have been confined to vaults, but their impressions were already present in roots, in nematode genomes, in the calls of birds that altered migration by tiny degrees. Each small interaction increased the chance that an adaptive trait might move beyond the vault's reach. Second, the selective study model has limits. A handful of scientists, however careful, cannot replace open, peer-reviewed inquiry. The task force understood that but judged the risk of immediate public disclosure higher than the risk of restricted research. They hoped to develop safe protocols within closed labs before wider release. That decision created a moral and practical dilemma. Who gets to learn first about a phenomenon that could change ecosystems and behaviors, and under what ethical rules? The historical record shows that those lines blurred. Contractors reported pressure to deliver conclusive statements before sufficient replication. Oversight panels received summaries instead of raw data. When transparency narrowed, trust withered. Third, there is a pragmatic public message that emerged from insiders' precaution. If the objects and behaviors in the vault learned from being watched, then any interaction, curiosity, mimicry, applauses data for them to use. Officials advised, quietly and inconsistently, a simple protocol for civilians: document at a distance. Do not touch, do not broadcast mimicked calls, and report findings through established scientific channels. These recommendations eventually coalesced into the guidance we will lay out later. Preserve evidence, protect metadata, and seek reputable handlers. Finally, the vault episode leaves an unresolved question about long-term governance. The task force could slow exchange and monitor spread, but it could not erase the fact that the biome had been altered. The only sustainable solution, many scientists argued, was broader oversight. Careful declassification of select data when it could be safely contextualized, and the creation of an interdisciplinary public forum to evaluate risks with community input. That proposal was repeatedly tabled. Bureaucracy and national security rationale, combined with the raw fear of what open acknowledgement might provoke, kept the vault's core findings under lock. In short, authorities acted deliberately, not recklessly. They contained, studied, and sanitized when possible. But containment alone cannot be the endpoint. If a system learns, adapts, and leaves traces in the world that surrounds it, the response must eventually include public science, environmental monitoring, and shared oversight. Until that happens, the vault remains a guarded fixer stopgap that protects for now but postpones the harder work of understanding and living with what was found beneath the redwoods. What follows is a practical playbook, clear, usable steps you can take now if you believe you've encountered something linked to the redwoods vault phenomena. The vault taught officials one blunt lesson: these anomalies learn from attention. That means the first rule is simple and counterintuitive: observe. Don't interact. Below are concrete actions organized so anyone can follow them, from a lone hiker to a community monitoring group. 1. Prioritize safety. If you feel threatened, leave immediately. Move to a safe location, away from the site, and avoid lingering. Keep others and pets back. Do not try to corner, pick up, or separate any biological matter. Even small contact can be harmful and can destroy the scientific value of the evidence. To record methodically without touching, begin with a wide-angle shot to show the site in landscape context. Tree lines, paths, clear markers like a signpost or rock. Next, take medium-range photos showing relative scale. Include a common object, a water bottle, a boot for size. If you can do so safely, take closer detail shots from a distance using optical zoom. For audio, leave at least 2 devices running in different positions to capture spatial differences. Always note the device used. 3. Collect and preserve metadata. Write down date, exact time, GPS coordinates, or a clear description of location, weather, wind direction, and your direction of travel. Record names and contact details of any witnesses and a brief statement of what each person observed. If possible, use a notes app that timestamps entries automatically. Screenshots of the filed properties on your phone can help later, for never handle biological material. Do not pick up hair, tissue, bones, or strange objects. Doing so risks contamination, legal exposure, and personal harm. If you must move for safety, photograph before and after. If someone has already disturbed the site, document the disturbance who, when, and how. 5. Protect digital evidence. After recording, back up originals immediately. Copy raw photo, video, audio files to at least 2 different storage locations, 1 local drive and 1 cloud backup. Avoid editing or compressing originals. Save edited versions separately. Use a simple hashing app. Many free tools exist to generate checksums for your files and save those values. This proves the files haven't been altered. Keep a log of each backup's time, method, and storage location. 6. Avoid amplifying potential mimicry. The Vault's archives show entities that mimic human sound. Don't broadcast or post audio clips publicly where the sounds could be replayed and learned from. Share evidence in controlled ways. Encrypted email to vetted researchers, private Dropboxes, or through organizations that accept sealed submissions. If you must use social media, post photos without audio and omit exact coordinates. 7. Contact the right people calmly and with proof. Reach out to regional university ecology or molecular biology departments, accredited wildlife agencies, or reputable independent cryptid research groups known for scientific rigor. Provide clear, timestamped evidence and metadata. If you prefer anonymity, use encrypted messaging or anonymous tip services that accept attachments. Keep copies of every correspondence. 8. Insist on chain of custody when turning material over. If authorities or researchers request physical evidence, ask for a written receipt, the names and positions of those taking custody, and an incident number. If you encounter resistance or deletion of files, document that interaction and seek legal advice. Public records and FOIA laws can be leveraged to preserve a paper trail. 9. Organize and join local monitoring. Many vault phenomena were first noticed by neighbors keeping watch over seasons. Create a small, disciplined group that shares protocols, standardized photo frames, synchronized timekeeping, secure evidence submission channels, and rotating observation shifts. Focus on data, not confrontation. Regularly aggregate your findings and, when patterns emerge, forward them to independent scientists. 10. Prepare for psychological effects. Exposure to anomalous behavior can be disorienting. If you or others feel anxiety, nightmares, or obsessive thinking after an encounter, seek mental health support. Trusted researchers involved in vault material sometimes require debriefing for precisely this reason. There's nothing shameful in asking for help. 11. Know your legal and safety options. If local authorities dismiss a credible report, escalate, ask for a written denial, file a formal complaint, and consult attorneys familiar with public records. Use FOIA requests for federal documents. If you fear retaliation for whistleblowing, document everything and seek organizations that assist protected disclosures. 12. Practice good community ethics. Don't encourage copycat behavior or curiosity-led pursuit. Educate fellow hikers and neighbors about documenting responsibly. Avoid sensationalizing evidence in public spaces that might lead inexperienced people into harm. These steps do 2 things. They protect you, and they make any evidence useful to science. The Redwoods Vault materials were only valuable because provenance and protocol were preserved. If we want this mystery studied rather than weaponized, the smallest act: careful, patient documentation, more than a viral clip or a daring confrontation. Finally, remember the bigger civic duty. Safe, transparent science requires oversight. Record what you find, keep it verifiable, and push for channels that allow peer review without abandoning public safety. The shadows in the Redwoods may be adaptive, but they are not unstoppable. If enough people document responsibly, preserve metadata, and demand accountable study, we force the conversation out of secrecy and into the light where evidence, not fear, guides the next steps. The Redwoods Vault was not a bureaucratic oddity. It was the government's blunt answer to a biological puzzle that refused to fit tidy categories. What they found: networked tissues that behaved like distributed brains, audio that learned and echoed human speech, woven substrates that responded to fields, and a short genetic motif blooming from specimen to soil was more than strange. It was a set of signs that something in those groves could observe, adapt, and cross the thin borders we draw between species, artifact, and environment. That matters because the Redwoods are not a laboratory. They are an ecosystem with human communities threaded through it. If an adaptive element can leave molecular traces in the soil, if a vocal pattern can learn from the sounds we make, then containment is not simply a technical problem, it is a civic one. The vault's existence shows how quickly a discovery can move from natural wonder to national security issue, and how secrecy can slow the only remedies that work in the long run: peer review, independent replication, and informed public oversight. So, what must happen next? First, transparency where safety allows. Classified status is sometimes necessary. Reckless disclosure could cause panic or misuse. But broad, peer-reviewed summaries of methods, results, and risk assessments must be released to independent scientists. We need transparent chains of custody for samples, open access to anonymized audio and spectrograms, and third-party replication of key experiments. Without these steps, claims stagnate into rumor, and the adaptive mystery only grows in the dark. Second, rigorous environmental monitoring. The data from the vault suggested localized isotopic enrichment and unexpected mutations in microfauna. Those are testable conditions. Long-term soil sampling, targeted nematode and microbial surveys, and genetic monitoring of local wildlife should be funded and shared publicly. If a recurring motif is present in the environment, then mapping its spread is not a political stunt. It is essential epidemiology for the natural world. Third, community-centered protocols. Locals were the first sensors of the rangers who logged equipment failures, the timber crews who smelled odd airs, the hikers who recorded calls at dusk. Any research or oversight must honor that role, train communities in sober documentation practices, and establish safe, secure reporting lines. This means funding independent hotlines, certifying local liaisons who can help preserve chain of custody, and offering legal protection for whistleblowers who bring verifiable evidence forward. Fourth, scientific safeguards that don't become smothering secrecy. Access to anomalous material should be limited to trained teams working under strong biosafety and ethical oversight. But those teams must include external auditors and subject matter experts from different institutions. Mental health monitoring for researchers exposed to disorienting materials should be standard, not to hide effects, but to care for those on the front lines of discovery. For ordinary citizens and visitors to the Redwoods, the practical guidance remains simple and urgent. Preserve your safety, document responsibly, and resist spectacle. Do not touch unidentified biological matter. Photograph and record from a safe distance, preserve metadata, and report to accredited organizations. If local authorities refuse to log your evidence, document that refusal and escalate. The small acts of careful documentation are what turn an anecdote into a piece of science. There is also a civic duty here. Governments can and should be held accountable for decisions that affect public ecological health. Demand oversight committees with access to classified findings under controlled conditions. Insist that any redaction be justified by narrow public safety concerns, not convenience. Support journalists and scientists who push for reasoned release. This is not anti-security. It is the opposite: security built on knowledge rather than ignorance. Finally, a word of caution that is also a call to courage. Adaptive phenomena exploit gaps between what we know and what we assume. Silence and secrecy widen those gaps. The Redwoods Vault was closed because those in power feared what the answers might force them to do. But silence protects nothing when an adaptive mystery is growing in a living landscape. The only durable protection comes from light. Careful scientific light shown steadily by communities, independent researchers, and accountable institutions. Stay curious, but stay careful. Preserve evidence, insist on transparency where it is safe, and demand the scientific scrutiny this discovery deserves. The Redwoods have stood for millennia. If something new is stirring among their roots, it should be met not with conspiracy or complacency, but with steady inquiry and public stewardship. The shadows will not step into the light on their own. We must bring the light responsibly and without fear. What comes next is not another list of risks. It's the real-world aftermath of discovery. When officials closed the Redwoods Vault, they did more than hide specimens. They set in motion a cascade of reactions that reshaped families, towns, science labs, and the forests themselves. People who lived near the vault woke to new rules and quieter roads. Scientists who touched the evidence had their careers diverted into secrecy, and the landscape around the vault began to show signs that whatever had been stored there had not stayed put. First, the human cost. Whistleblowers faced gag orders and, in several cases, career retaliation. Local rangers who pressed for transparency found their reports reclassified or erased, driving a wedge between field personnel and their supervisors. Some families report strange, persistent sounds at night and animals behaving all deer, walking in tight circles, scavengers avoiding certain ravines. For residents, the vault became a living stain, a source of anxiety, a rumor engine, and, for a few courageous souls, a reason to organize. Second, the scientific reckoning. The fragments in audio forced universities and independent labs to change how they handle unknown biological material. Protocols now emphasize strict chain of custody, certified containment labs, and multi-institutional review before publication. A small network of accredited labs was quietly formed to study samples under shared oversight. Their work is painfully slow. By design, every result is cross-checked, every method audited, because releasing the wrong conclusion could make a dangerous problem worse. Third, the ecological implications. Environmental tests near the vault showed molecular traces in soil, water, and microphone evidence that some element once inside the vault had bled into the living landscape. This is why monitoring matters: regular soil grids, long-term nematode and insect surveys, eDNA sampling of streams, and acoustic arrays to pick up anomalous vocal patterns. These tools give a map of change over time. Where anomalies rise, researchers seal the site and scale up testing. That slow, patient work is the only way to tell if a marker is a local curiosity or the start of a wider integration. What should communities and responsible researchers do now? Start with transparent oversight. Local councils should push for a civilian review board with the power to demand verified, redacted reports. Scientists should publish protocols and raw, anonymized data so qualified peers can evaluate findings without risking exposure. Journalists must insist on access to documents and to the experts who have been muzzled. Citizens should build non-confrontational monitoring programs, volunteer camera traps, acoustic recorders, and secure evidence-sharing platforms that preserve metadata and protect identities. These collective measures reduce secrecy and increase safety. At the same time, do not be reckless. The instinct to go looking driven by fear, curiosity, or the viral pull of social media can create hazards. Unauthorized sampling can spread contaminants, disturb evidence, and provoke adaptive responses from whatever is lurking in those forests. If you find something unusual, document from a distance, back up your files, and hand them to qualified authorities or vetted independent scientists under a documented chain of custody. Finally, the political question: who gets to decide when the public has a right to know? Secrecy is sometimes justified by safety, but secrecy must be balanced by oversight. Demand mechanisms that let independent experts review sensitive material under strict protections and, where possible, allow the public an account of risks and findings. Push for legal frameworks that require narrow, time-limited classification and a path to declassification when danger is mitigated. The vault taught us a hard lesson. Knowledge bared out of fear becomes a liability. The only durable protection is clear-eyed, collaborative inquiry done safely, done transparently, and done with the communities who live under the redwoods. If an adaptive mystery is moving through the roots and undergrowth, the answer won't come from silence. It will come from steady, shared work, careful monitoring, verified science, and public insistence that shadows be examined, not ignored. Bring the light and bring it together.